Good evening. I'm Dick Clay. I'm the president and CEO of the Filson Historical Society. Thank you all for joining us both in person and virtually this evening for a legacy of service, a conversation with retired United States Representative John Yarmuth. Now, I have the honor of interviewing tonight's distinguished guest, and it is indeed my pleasure to tell you more about him now. Retired United States Representative John Yarmuth represented the 3rd Congressional District of Kentucky from 2007 until 2023. His district encompassed the vast majority of the Louisville Metro Area, and he worked tirelessly on critical issues affecting his constituents. From 2013 onward, he was the sole Democratic member of Kentucky's congressional delegation. Yarmuth chaired the House Budget Committee from 2019 to 2023, and he played a pivotal role in shaping the nation's financial policies during his tenure. A graduate of Atherton High School and Yale University, Congressman Yarmuth founded Louisville Today and the Louisville Eccentric Observer, also known as LEO. Once a Republican staffer for United States Senator Marlowe Cook, he became a Democrat in 1985 during the height of the Reagan presidency, and describes himself as a solid progressive. He served 8 terms, 16 years, under 3 different presidents: George W. Bush, President Obama, and Trump. With that, welcome. I'm going to come over and we'll get this started. What is your overall political philosophy and what led you to it?
Well, thanks, Dick, and thank you all for being here. That's nice that people still want to hear what I have to say. When I ran for office, the one thing that I said consistently was, I think government is the way we organize our responsibilities to each other. And that's kind of my philosophy of government is we're in a society, we have neighbors, we have fellow countrymen and women, and if we don't have responsibilities to each other, then the society cannot survive. It's not sustainable, and it becomes anarchy. And so the way we handle that is through government, and that's kind of my philosophy. That's not the only part of my philosophy, because I do believe that government has an obligation to, in a capitalistic society, to balance the scales, because anybody who's been in business, and I've been in business, and I come from a family of business people, knows that there are, what's the best way to put it? There are innocent bystanders of capitalism, and people who through no fault of their own are not able to reap the benefits of the capitalistic system. And there has to be a way to balance that and understand that not everything is in a capitalistic society is merit-based. Not everybody earns what they make. And luck has to do with so much of it, and timing, and anyway, so I believe the government has an obligation to, again, try to take care of those who were not able to navigate the capitalistic system as well as others.
You were a member of the Republican Party until 1985. What caused your change?
Well, so I was always, I don't think my political philosophy has changed at all. I was very comfortable in the Republican Party as a progressive for a long time. And if you think back to the 60s and 70s, and you think about the Republican Party obviously was the party of Lincoln, ended slavery, the Republicans were the environmental party. Teddy Roosevelt was the first environmentalist president. President Nixon created under him the Environmental Protection Agency, the Consumer Product Safety Commission. So there was not a problem at all with being a progressive in the Republican Party until Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan changed the entire, he kind of tilted the political spectrum in a different direction. And then he started allowing people like Pat Robertson and Jerry Falwell and others to, in my opinion, have a disproportionate influence on the government's policy. That frightened me, not just as a Jewish American, but as somebody who just didn't believe that religion should be a determinant factor in government policy. And so I was becoming increasingly alarmed about not just that, the influence of the religious right on government, but also the policies that the Reagan administration was advancing. So I was getting nervous, more and more nervous as the Reagan administration went on. And then in 1985, Jerry Falwell went to South Africa, and he came back and made a speech in which he called Desmond Tutu a phony. And I said, that's it. I've had it with these people. Next day, I walked in and changed my registration.
You told me at one point, as we were talking before this evening, that your mother had a large influence on your philosophy. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I mean, my dad was, a dynamic figure. He was a very successful business person and made his mark in one way. But my mother was kind of the moral influence. And she was very active in the Human Relations Commission in the late 60s, early 70s here, and was always the one who would focus on helping people and being sympathetic and empathetic and compassionate. And so I think in terms of early influences on my political philosophy, she had the largest impact.
It's 2006.
Yeah.
And the president at that time is George, help me out here. George Walker Bush. And there is an entrenched Republican Congresswoman in Ann Northup. What made you decide to run at that point? And how did you feel about your chances? Who encouraged you? What led you to the decision?
Well, I can't remember which came first, but I remember in 2005, I was fully expecting Jack Conway to run for that seat. He had run 3 years before that in 2002, barely lost to Ann Northup, had some unbelievable bad luck. At the end of the campaign, I think he could have won, and I thought he was going to run again. And in the summer of 2005, he told me I was all excited about supporting him, and he told me he wasn't going to run. And so I said at that point to myself, damn, she's going to get a free pass again. And what I meant by that was she had been very lucky in a number of her races in that she was running against people who were relatively unknown, and she was able to define them the way she wanted them to be defined for the electorate, as opposed to the way they wanted to define themselves. And she benefited from a couple of fortunate goofs on some of the part of the Democratic candidates. And I looked at it and said, when Jack said he wasn't going to run, I said, I'm the only person who can beat her. And I don't think that was an egomaniacal thing. It was just that I knew I had enough name recognition in the community that she wasn't going to be able to demonize me the way she had been able to other candidates. And going back there, I had sold Leo in 2003. I was working about 3 or 4 hours a week. I had the perfect life. I was playing 150 rounds of golf a year. I was doing a lot of civic and charitable work. I was writing a column for Leo still and doing a TV show. And it was like, why do I need this? I've got the perfect life. And I said, well, if I can make this district be one of the 15 that flips from Republican to Democrat and changes the majority in the House and puts an end to the Bush agenda, then I will have done something important, whether I like the job or not. And so I was pushed along and encouraged by a number of people, not that far. Well, the most significant of whom was Christy Brown, who beat on me unmercifully to run.
No.
And you know what that means when Christy does. And Owsley was alive at that time, and Owsley was very, very supportive and helpful. And I never forget one night we noticed, my wife and I, she noticed that the distiller, the master distiller from Old Forester, was going to be at Bourbon's Bistro doing a lecture while people ate. And so she said, let's go and let's call Christy and Owsley and see if they want to go. So we called them and they said, yeah, sure, we'd love to meet you there. So they come to dinner. Mary Moss Greenbaum came as well. You know, those of you who know her know that she's a force to be reckoned with. So the five of us were sitting there drinking for a number of hours, and they're beating on me to run, and they kind of engaged the rest of the restaurant. So all these people were doing that. And so, I mean, that was, again, a significant motivation. And so I called the then chair of the Jefferson County Democratic Party and told him I was interested in the race. And he said, well, that's great. Nice to know, but we've already kind of identified a candidate, and we hope that, you know, we vetted him with the DCCC, Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, then led by Rahm Emanuel. You will remember him. I have bittersweet memories of Rahm, and he's now our ambassador to Japan, which to me is ludicrous, because if you put ambassador and Rahm Emanuel in the same, that is definitely an oxymoron. But so I said, well, that's great. His name is Andrew Horn. So they said, I said, well, I don't want to mess things up with a primary. I'd love to meet him. And, you know, so I go to a meeting where a number of big Democratic supporters and donors were present. And Andrew spoke. Oh, in the meantime, this is a great story. In the meantime, I get a call from Mike Murphy, and Mark Murphy. And Mark says to me, John, I heard you were interested in the 3rd district race. I know Andrew Horn. He's a great guy, but he's not nearly as liberal as you or I. And if you don't run, I'm going to. So now I'm thinking, well, there's going to be a primary anyway. So I went to meet to the session and met Andrew. And after the session, I talked to the people who were there, and they said, we don't, you know, I said, what do you think? And they said, you're a much better candidate than Andrew. And Andrew's a wonderful man. And we've become very close. Not certainly close, but we've become friendly. And anyway, I went back and forth. And with about 10 days to go before, I don't think I've ever told this story publicly. About 10 days before the filing deadline, I decided I wasn't going to do it. And I get emotional when I do this, even though it's so far in the past. Anyway, I told my son that I wasn't going to run. And I could tell that he was so crestfallen when I said that I said, wow, he really wants me to do this. So said, okay, I changed my mind. I'm going to do it. The rest is history. So there was a 4-way primary, Andrew Horn and 2 others, Pearl Farnsley, and can't remember the 4th great guy, Jimmy, something. Anybody remember? Good guy. Anyway, so I got 54% of the vote in the primary. And the kind of the funny story was that Rahm Emanuel, who did not want me to run, who wanted Andrew Horn to run because that was his vision, was you found a candidate who had no negatives. Didn't matter whether they didn't have any positives or not. They just didn't. He just wanted somebody who's not vulnerable to attack. And Andrew was an Iraq War veteran, and but he had become a Democrat like 10 days before he announced he was running, because you're not supposed to be involved in partisan politics in the military. Anyway, so when Rahm said, they'll beat you to death with your columns. And I said, I know they'll try, but I have 150,000 readers. And if just my readers vote for me, I win. Right. And Rahm just didn't understand the 3rd district. He thought, because there had been a race in the 4th district with Nick Clooney, who he had written columns and so forth, and George Clooney's father, and had run for Congress, and they beat him in a primary, and with running against his columns. And I said, the 3rd district's not the 4th district, Rahm. Just get that out of your head. Anyway, so Rahm admitted that he made a mistake after I was elected. It was really big of him.
Well, I'll always think of Bourbon's Bistro as like Hamilton, the room where it happened.
Yeah.
And then followed by the conversation with your son.
Yeah, but so anyway, so I said, if I win and we can flip control of the House, I will have accomplished something significant. It doesn't matter whether I like the job. And I stayed 16 years.
Along those lines, 16 years in Congress is a significant period of time. And you had a mentor in Marlo Cook who had, I think, a very good view of constituent policy, for lack of a better phrase. What did he teach you?
Well, Marlo taught me a lot. Marlo was like a second father to me. And, but I asked him one day, Senator, how do you decide on any particular issue whether to vote your personal philosophy or how you perceive your constituents want you to vote? And he said to me, I always try to vote the way I perceive my constituents' preference is, unless I believe I have more information than they do, which is always. And I never forgot that. And that's one of the things in that job, it's kind of like I can't quote it, but there's a famous quote by Edmund Burke about representative government. And it's basically says that's what it's all about. The voters trust you to make the judgment. You can't listen to them on any particular issue. They sent you there to use your judgment. And then you defend what you did and explain it. And that's kind of the way I did my job.
You spent an awful lot of time over the years here in Louisville talking to constituents. And I guess one thing I've wondered about is, over this period of time, how you observed people defining themselves by their political identities, and did that change over time?
It has definitely changed. And this is something that I am really obsessed with these days. And I've had a number of conversations with different people, different, political observers. And I said, how is it that a person's political affiliation has become such an important part of their identity? Because when I was growing up, we never thought of ourselves as Republicans or Democrats. We were Kentucky or Louisville fans, but we never thought about our political party identification, and that has really changed. And it's just part of this huge, what Bill Bishop, some of you remember Bill Bishop, married
Julie Artery.
Ann Artery.
Yeah, Julie Artery.
Julie Artery.
Yeah.
And was at the Lexington Herald Leader, wrote a book called The Big Sort. And this was in 2010. And it was all about how the country was sorting itself by political affiliation, by where you went to church, where you went to synagogue, where you lived, all these different things. And he was way ahead of, he observed it early on in the trend. And I still don't understand why. I've had different theories advanced to me. Jill Lepore, the historian, was in town a few weeks ago for the author forum. I asked her what she thought about that. And she said, I think it's the political consultants, because the political consultants have tried to, their whole methodology is to play identity and demonize the other side and so forth. And that may be a factor. Other people think it's cable news. I'm not sure what it is, but it's a very, I think it's the heart of our political dysfunction right now, and governmental dysfunction. I was at a month or so ago, I was at the Pine Room, and I was sitting there, and a couple sat next to me. Kathy was somewhere else, my wife. And so this woman sits down, and she recognized me, and she said, John, hi, I'm a Republican, but, and she said very nice things, and she kept talking, and within the first 10 or 12 sentences that she uttered, she said, I'm a Republican 5 or 6 times. And when she stopped, I said to her, I usually don't do stuff like this, but it just struck me. And I said, it's really sad to me that you think that's the most important thing you have to tell me about yourself, that you're a Republican. And she looked at me like I hit her. And then she reflected on it a minute, and she said, that's really interesting. I'm going to have to think about that. But that's the way the country is right now. And it's, again, I don't really know why it's happened, but until we break that down, the idea that we can compromise on issues, that we can respect what the other side has to say, is complicated for sure.
For sure.
Yeah, but it's very different now than it was when I started in Congress.
Over the 16 years, what were some of the special things that you got to do that you really enjoyed?
Well, I flew on Air Force One twice. And the first time was we were going to it was with Obama. President Obama was going to Northern Kentucky to do a thing on the Brent Spence Bridge about infrastructure. And I flew with Rand Paul, and that wasn't really all that interesting. But the second time was Jerry Abramson. This was in, I think, 2015. Jerry Abramson was working then for President Obama. He was the liaison to state and local governments. And he had convinced Obama to come make a visit to Louisville, just to make a visit. It wasn't anything particular. But coincidentally, the trip happened on the day when they signed the Iran nuclear deal. So we were told to go to show up at the White House at 11 o'clock or 11:30, which I did. And then the deal got done. And we said, well, we're going to be delayed some because now there's going to be a Rose Garden ceremony where President Obama addresses the nation, talks about that. So we waited around and watched that. I was up in Jerry's office, which was right above the Oval. And finally, we get to we finish with that. We go out to Andrews, we get on the plane, and I'm the only one in the VIP cabin. So And Jerry, who was a staffer, was in the staff cabin. So I'm there with 4 people waiting on me in the VIP cabin. And so one of the presidents, normally the president would come back and spend 15 minutes with whoever was in the VIP cabin during the trip. But this guy comes back and he says, the president's not going to be able to come back and talk with you because he's calling all the world leaders, explaining the Iran nuclear deal to them. Said, totally understand. So we land in Louisville, and the guy motions me forward toward the front, and Barack comes out and he says, we talked for 3 or 4 minutes, and then he said, let's go. So we walk down the steps. So this is the $1 million shot that anybody wants. You're walking down the steps from Air Force One with the President of the United States in your hometown. So only one problem. Nobody had told me what I was supposed to do. So we got down to the bottom of the steps, and there's a couple people from the Air National Guard were there and met us, and we spent a minute or so there. And out of the corner of my eye, I see Jerry Abramson walking toward the presidential limousine. Again, nobody's told me where I'm supposed to go. So I'm standing there. President Obama starts walking toward the limousine. He turns around, sees that I'm not with him, and he says, John, come on. So, okay, I get in the limousine. So Jerry and the president are sitting in the seat looking forward, and I'm sitting in the seat looking backward. And I said, would it be tacky of me if I took a picture of you two? And Obama says, no, it would be stupid. You need to be here. Jerry needs to be taking the picture. So he made Jerry and switch seats with me so Jerry could take the picture of the 2 of us. And it's just a wonderful picture of the 2 of us smiling with the presidential seal between us. Anyway, so that was a great moment. Great event. I played golf with Obama in 2015. That was one of the best days I ever spent on the golf course. He was a joy to play with. I was amazed that there was not 1 minute of that day, except a brief interlude, when I thought he was focused on anything but the golf game. He knew where everybody's ball was. He was totally engaged in it. I couldn't believe that he could compartmentalize that well. And I was in the cart with him for 4 hours, which is pretty special. And by the way, he had a special Gatorade, strawberry flavored Gatorade that was, that every time we go to the green, we come back. It was a really hot day. We come back and magically everything had been restocked in the cart. I don't know where, little gremlins in the woods. Anyway, it was a great day. The only time we ever talked business was, I mentioned to him at one time, I said, Mr. President, this was not too long before we were going to vote on the Iran nuclear deal. I said, I think our messaging on the Iran deal is off. And he said, what do you mean? I said, well, we keep throwing all these numbers out there, 5 years, 8 years, 20 years, 25 years. Not one of those dates has anything to do with nuclear weapons. That's all about the Iranians' peaceful nuclear program for energy and research and so forth. I said, what we should be saying, I think, is that under this deal, Iran agrees that they will never acquire or possess a nuclear weapon. And there is an unprecedented inspection regime in place, a regimen in place to guarantee that. And he said, that makes sense. We're a little bit concerned about our messaging. So 2 days later, he was on Jon Stewart, and he used my exact line. So I was really, really happy about that. But anyway, so that was cool, playing golf with Obama. The last one, I guess, was I had never been in the Oval Office before. And when we were doing the American Rescue Plan, we about a dozen of us were invited down to meet with Biden. at the White House. And so we went, this was during still the COVID protocols. So we went down, we had to get there real early in the morning to get tested and so forth. And then we got moved, shuttled around. And finally we went outside, we went back inside, and we went through this room. And then we went through this door, and Biden's standing on the other side of the door. And when I went in, Mr. President, he said, "Hey, you need to give me a golf lesson soon." I said, "Okay, anytime, just call me." And I looked up and I said, "Oh my God, it's the Oval Office." I didn't know. So my seat was right in front of the Resolute desk. If you've seen where he is, so he and Vice President Harris sit, there are two couches that run perpendicular to the Resolute desk, and then they're in two chairs at the beginning. And so I'm right there looking at them. And I looked around, and in about 30 seconds, I said, "I get it. I get why they call this the biggest home court advantage in the world." It's quite a thing to go there. I got to go to Camp David too, not with the Democratic president, ironically. Mick Mulvaney, who I know this will confuse a lot of people, Mick's a friend of mine, and he invited Kathy and me to go to Camp David with a few other couples, and so we spent a day and a half there, and that was fascinating as well, and a great experience. So, yeah, got to do some cool things.
What would you say your most gratifying accomplishments were?
Well, clearly, I would say, first of all, having been involved in the Affordable Care Act, I was on the Ways and Means Committee in 2009, 2010, and we were one of the three committees that drafted the ACA. So I was very much involved in drafting that. But obviously, there were an awful lot of other people who were really played larger roles in that. But I also, when we did the American Rescue Plan, because we used a procedure called reconciliation, which I don't want to get in the weeds on, but anything that's done by reconciliation, which is the process where you can pass something in the Senate with fewer than 60 votes, you can pass it with a simple majority, and that has to come through the Budget Committee. So as chair of the Budget Committee, my name was the lead sponsor on that bill. If you Google American Rescue Plan, it'll come up and say Mr. Yarmuth, and I did all the shepherding through the House. And if you can remember, we were in the same position then as Republicans are now in the House. We could only lose 5 votes. And there were, there were a lot of differences of opinion. We knew we weren't going to get one Republican vote for that bill. And there were a lot of different opinions on the Democratic side. So I was the one who had to go to all the different caucuses and make the case for whatever we were going to end up with. And what I would do is I would go in and I would say, whether it was the Progressives or the Blue Dogs or and whoever it was, the New Dems, I would say, look, you need to advocate as forcefully and passionately as possible for your preferences in this bill, for your priorities. You need to scream as loud as you can. And that's your responsibility, and you should do it. But understand, you're going to vote for whatever comes out of here. You're going to vote for the final product, whatever it is. And we lost 1 vote. So I spent months and months and months doing that. And, Republicans say, well, they weren't willing to compromise with us on that. Well, Republicans were never going to vote for anything we did. So it didn't matter. And I said, we weren't willing to compromise. That bill started at $6 trillion. $6 trillion. It had childcare. It had all these other things in it. It ended up at $1.9 trillion, and it didn't have this, and it didn't have this, and it didn't have this. We compromised with ourselves. That's what we did. But, we passed a bill that was the second costliest bill in the history of the country. And then we passed the Inflation Reduction Act, basically between $800 and $900 billion. That also had my name on it. I wasn't nearly as, I didn't have as much of a leadership role in that, but I like to say that I spent more money under my name than anybody in the history of the United States. Because it was 1.9 trillion and 800 billion. It's 2.7 trillion. It's the most that anybody's ever had spent under their name. And, you know, it's, if you think back to when we did the American Rescue Plan, you know, this was $1,400 for every adult, $300 or $250 a month for every child. We brought 40% of kids above the poverty level of that bill. We saved innumerable state and local governments from bankruptcy. I mean, I doubt you can find many mayors or governors anywhere in the country who don't think the American Rescue Plan was a godsend to their communities. I know if you ask Greg Fisher and now Craig about that, they would say it was hugely important to us. And now then we did the infrastructure bill. That I had nothing to do with that, but still so many projects now being built. The Inflation Reduction Act, the largest commitment to climate change policies in the history of the world. It will end up, by one estimate, being over $1 trillion of money invested in mitigating climate change. So, yeah, I feel like not necessarily I could drop the mic, but it was a good time to retire after those two. There was one other thing, Dick, you and I didn't talk about this. There was a kink in the system of veterans of spousal benefits. And they had tried what happened was, when you're in the military, you get automatic spousal survival benefits if your spouse dies in service. And then you can buy insurance on your own and have it. Somebody wrote in the bill 30 or 40 years ago that if you had both, that they offset. And it made no sense. I mean, why would you buy insurance if you're not gonna get the benefit of it? And it got to the point where there were about 65,000 surviving spouses who were deprived of tens of thousands of dollars each because of this quirk in the law. And all sorts of people have tried to get it changed, and it basically was about an $8 billion cost to fix it. And nobody could get it done. And I finally went to Adam Smith, who was chairman of the Armed Services Committee, and I said, Adam, let's just get this done. Can't you? You've got an $800 billion bill, defense bill, you're putting down. Why can't you find $8 billion? Just shove it in there somewhere and fix it. And he said, I can't do it. I can't do it. And then somebody on the other side pissed him off. And he came back to me and said, okay, they made me so mad, I'm going to do it. So we ended up getting it fixed. And that was, again, something that was 30 or 40 years old. And so many people had been deprived of benefits that they were entitled to. And I think the ceremony we had for the signing of that bill, and so many of the surviving spouses were there. It was just a very, very gratifying thing. Nobody will ever know that was done except them, but something I was really proud of.
On a local level, what do you think you accomplished that made you the proudest? A couple of things.
Well, I won't take credit for the VA hospital, although I will take credit for staying on top of it from day one till what we see now. When I got elected, one of the first things I did was within the first 30 or 40 days is I called the VA in because they had announced the summer of 2006 that Louisville's going to get a new VA hospital. They had made that determination, and they did it to help Ann, that her campaign. They had no money, no timetable, no location. So anyway, I said, come in and tell me what the process is for getting this done. And so the VA came in and they told me some things. And I said, at one point I said, so at what point do the veterans get to have a voice? And they said to me, they don't. We do it on our own. We don't talk to the veterans. I said, I don't think that's acceptable. And then I said, what about the city and University of Louisville medical school, since the U of L doctors are the ones who staff the hospital? And they said, oh, we don't talk to them either. I said, well, they said, we haven't been able to talk to them. I said, well, why not? And they said, your predecessor wouldn't let us. And I said, well, if I can set up the meeting with with the university and with the city government, will you meet with them? And they said, of course, we'd love to. So we set that meeting up and put all that in motion. And, ultimately, it went out of Brownsboro Road after many, many years. That was not where I wanted it to be. They didn't listen to me either. But actually, I wanted it to go at 18th and Broadway on the property where the Passport, whatever it's now called, the company that's taking over Passport, hopefully they get that building completed. But so anyway, I was involved in that. And the bridges, I don't take any credit for the bridges, except that what we did was we made sure that the papers that were necessary to get the project done never sat on a desk for very long. We were just constantly prodding the agencies to move the process along. And once Indiana and Kentucky had come to an agreement, but I had some role in that. Probably the one I look at the most in terms of kind of physical was Shepherd Square, which I actually kind of extorted it.
Kind of.
When I say that, so we were getting ready to vote on the cap and trade bill, Waxman-Markey, in 2009. And it was a very close vote. And I was not really playing it cagey, because when leadership would ask me about it, because they were concerned about any district where there was where a disproportionate share of their energy was generated by coal, and we were 90% then. So we were one of those districts. So they were never confident of my vote, even though when they asked me about it, I said, I can't see myself voting against Waxman-Markey. But anyway, they considered me undecided. So the day before the vote, they called my chief of staff, Julie Carr, and said, your boss is 217, would be 217. That's what we needed at the time, 217 votes. And they said, what can we do to get your vote? Get his vote, make sure we get his vote. So I said, well, I'm going to take advantage of this. So I called Jerry, who was mayor then. I said, what can we ask for, Jerry? What's your top priority? And we decided on the Shepherd Square, that Hope 6 project. And that's what we got ultimately. And so, I drive by that with a certain degree of pride. So, but the thing that I'm proudest of over my 16 years in terms of local activity was that, and I didn't even think about this when I was running the first time, but I realized it very quickly. The most important part of this job is to make your constituents feel they have a connection to their government and have somebody to talk to who will listen to them. And so, this district is so good because it's so compact. So you can do 8 or 10 events in one day. You can go to 3 schools, 3 businesses, a neighborhood festival, and you can talk to so many people, or you can just walk through Costco on the weekend, which is what I consider the best politics I ever did. And so you're able to get so much FaceTime with people, and that's, again, it's a really incredibly important part of the job, and it goes beyond bringing pork back. It goes beyond casting the right votes. It's just, I saw a headline on the news today, something like Americans' faith in government at lowest levels ever, or something like that. And, that's what I hope, that being out there and showing up basically is what it is. And talking to people is the thing that hopefully would make people believe, well, government's willing to listen to me. And that's really what most people want. But anyway,
well, I've noticed that you have a lapel badge on, and it's a bright red F, and that I'm wondering what that is.
Well, I'm not a Florida fan, or because it would be orange, but so one of my top priorities over my career in Congress was to do something about gun safety, and we haven't done very much on it. But in 2018, the spring of 2018, I was at dinner with my wife and my son and his then fiance. And I said, I'm thinking about having a button made that says, proud to have an F rating from the NRA. Because the NRA, like a lot of other organizations, rates members of Congress on their voting record as it relates to their issues. And so and my now daughter-in-law said, don't do that, just do an F. I said, you're right, that's brilliant. So I had these buttons made, put it on my lapel, took a picture of it, did social media, proud to be wearing my F rating from the NRA, went viral, gave pins to my colleagues who wanted them. They all did the same thing. Every time they did it, it went viral. And a few months later, the NRA announced that they were taking their ratings off their website because, the way they put it, our enemies are using them against us. So I'm very proud of this. Once I left Congress, said, oh, okay, I'm going to stop wearing it because technically I don't have an F rating from the NRA. So I stopped wearing them. And then the shooting at the bank happened here, and Tommy Elliott, who many people in this room I'm sure knew, and I knew well, was killed. And his daughter Claire worked for me for 8 years, was my scheduler for the last 5 years of my term. So, you're not as close to any staffer as you are your scheduler. So she's like a daughter to me, and such a tragic thing. So I said, I'm putting it back on until we get something more important done about guns.
What issues? No, let me save that for a minute. January 6, 2021. What was your experience, and how have you coped with it? And your colleagues, how have they coped?
So I was in my office. We had told the staff to stay home that day, not because we anticipated what ended up happening, but because we knew there were going to be a lot of crazy people in town, and it was like the third day of the session. So there was no legislative business being done. Well, we were going to vote on the electors. And so we just said, stay home. So I'm in the office by myself. We were evacuated about 12:30 when they found a bomb across the street from my office building. And then we were let back in 45 minutes later. And then about 2 o'clock, I guess, we got a message on our phone, external threat to the Capitol, stay in your office, lock the door, stay away from the windows. So I'm in my office by myself. Obviously, I'm watching the TV, and I'm seeing what everybody else saw, just the external stuff, the people hanging from the sides of the building, the Capitol. And I'm just... And
you're in a separate building.
Yeah. I was in the Canada. So the Capitol is between Independence and Constitution Avenues. across Independence Avenue, there are the three House office buildings where all the members have their offices, and then across Constitution, the Senate offices. So I was in my office and couldn't hear. I'm on the fourth floor on the outside, so I have windows, but I still couldn't hear anything going on. But so I'm there as the day goes on, and I was getting text messages from some of my buddies who were in the gallery in the House, who had gone to watch the count. And of course, they were all traumatized. They heard the shot fired. They, the people pounding on the doors trying to get into the House chamber. They had to get gas masks on. They were down crouching between the seats in the gallery. And it was so surreal. It was like I'm watching something in another country. Could not believe it was happening. And we still didn't know what was going on inside the building, where they were in Pelosi's office and they were defecating in the halls, and that all came out later. So I did probably, I probably did 2 hours or more of TV interviews from my office. And I know I sounded like a moron, because it's like there was no way to explain what was going on. And it was by far the darkest day of my professional career in any capacity, certainly in Congress. A year later, we had a 1-year anniversary ceremony in the Capitol with John Meacham and Doris Kearns Goodwin, and then 4 or 5 members who were recounting their experiences. And I was there, and I had to do a TV interview at 3. I think this started at 1:30, and I was getting so upset that I said, I've got to leave and compose myself before I do this 3 o'clock interview, because I was, it wasn't PTSD, but it was some analogous thing. And that was a year later. My friend Dan Kildee from Michigan, he's admittedly has gone to therapy because of it. It was just one thing that, Americans attacking Americans, and Americans attacking the center of your government. Just something I'll never understand, and I still can't deal with it. And I don't think many of my colleagues can either.
You thought, I think, about leaving Congress in 2016 or thereabouts, but changed your mind.
Yeah, when I was elected, people said, how long do you think you'll stay? And I said, well, if I'm not beaten in an election, I can't imagine myself staying more than 10 years. So 16 would have been the right time. And I think, and I've said this before, if Hillary had won the presidency at that point, that next term would have been my last one, because I would have felt comfortable in leaving. But once Trump won, I said, I've got to stick around for the fight. And I'm glad I did, because I wouldn't have been chairman of the budget committee if I had left then. And I wouldn't have those things to look back on proudly. But if Hillary had been elected president, I would have served 1 term with her, and then I would have been gone.
With President Biden, you decided to retire. Was that hard on you?
Well, I turned 75 last November. I'll be 76 in another month or so. And my decision to retire was, I don't know whether I have 5 minutes left or 25 years, but I'm going to control whatever time I have left. And that was really all it is. I have a 4-year-old. grandson and a 15-month-old grandson. And it was like, I don't want to miss anything in their lives. It didn't have anything to do with the prospect of being in the minority. Although I will say that looking at what's going on now, if I were there still, I would be beating my head against the wall. I mean, it's bad enough watching it on from afar, but if I had to be there every day dealing with those nuts, so I'm very comfortable with my decision. And although I will tell you, I was there last week, I was there on Wednesday, first time I'd been back on the floor since I left in January. And it was just incredibly emotional. And to see my old friends and the floor staff and so forth, and they were all, at least they acted happy to see me. And it was just like, yeah, there's certain things about it I miss. I mean, it's a very heady existence. And one of the things that, oh, by the way, I will just say this, every one of my colleagues, without exception, every one of my colleagues, my Democratic colleagues I talked to said, we really miss you, but we love Morgan. So, and they made it a point to say that, which is, you know, made me feel really good. But I realized after 3 or 4 months out of the job that there's an energy that is in you when you do that job for 16 years and you have to be on all the time wherever you are, and there's adrenaline because you're going 90 miles an hour most of the time, and then all of a sudden that adrenaline goes away, and it's a really hard physiological adjustment. I never expected it, but it's like, oh God, it's a different, this feels very different. So I haven't adjusted yet at all. Trying to stay busy. I'm trying to put together a number of things to do. I'm going to be a visiting scholar. Well, I am now a visiting scholar at UK. I teach a couple courses, co-teach a couple courses at U of L. I'm talking to some think tanks in Washington so I can stay involved in public policy in a different way. But yeah, I definitely haven't adjusted to it. But again, I don't regret the decision at all.
There's a pretty inspirational article in this morning's Washington Post on United States senators, all baby boomers who have recently retired and what they're doing with their lives. It's worth a read for everybody in this room.
I haven't read it yet, but I've heard about it. Yeah. Well, Mitt Romney, if you read his Atlantic piece, there were a lot of really interesting things that he had to say about being retired, about that role and leaving it, and what it would mean to him to leave it.
I've badly gone through the entire hour. I think I'm going to have some editorial privilege here, and we'll have questions from the audience. If anyone would like to ask one, please come up to the mic. We'll take 5 minutes for this, or else the people on the videos, the virtual part will kill me.
Okay.
Along with the Filson staff.
I try to give more concise responses. Go ahead.
Well, I can't believe I've listened to you for an hour and you've never mentioned his name. I know that you and Mitch McConnell were compatriots at one time, and I am really curious as how you guys got along. And then a follow-up question would be, do you think it's time for him to retire? Health wise.
That's the real reason I was retiring. I decided I wanted to send a message to Mitch. So Mitch and I have known each other since 1968. During that summer, I was still in college. We traveled the state together, setting up college campus organizations for Marlowe Cook. We were political allies for a while. We obviously have gone in very different directions. And, you know, Mitch, when I announced that I was retiring, Mitch called me, which was, I think the only time he ever called me in 16 years. I never was in his office. He never was in mine. And we found ourselves on the planes together a lot, going back and forth. And we've always been very civil, but we really haven't ever talked about policy. And I think both he and I recognize that a lot of what we do is political theater, and we're both pretty thick-skinned. And I'll tell you, I just said I wasn't going to go to give elaborate questions, but I got to tell this story. I've called Mitch a liar on national television. I've said horrible things about him because I'm never going to let him get away with stuff. But back in 2000, and it's either 9 or 10, Louisville Magazine did a story on Mitch, and they interviewed me for it. And this will become, you'll understand why I mentioned this. This is before Tiger Woods had his problems. Okay. This is when he's riding high, he's the icon of the world. And I said during the interview that Mitch McConnell has gotten up every day since he was 5 years old, and the first thing and the last thing he thinks about is how he's going to advance his own political career. And I said, to me, he's the Tiger Woods of politics. This Tiger started when he was 2 years old. And I said, and that makes him a very formidable figure. So Mitch, we were somewhere together, and Mitch says, "Why'd you take that shot at me?" And I said, "What shot's that?" And he said, "Calling me the Tiger Woods of politics." I said, "Mitch, you call me the Tiger Woods of anything, and I consider it a great compliment." But of all the things I had said about him negative, that's the one thing that got under his skin, which was very strange. Anyway, so, but when he called me when I announced I was retiring, it was incredibly gracious. He couldn't have been nicer. And I said to him, "Mitch, I haven't really enjoyed being the one who has to take you on all the time, but I'm the only Democrat in the federal delegation, so I'm the one they called." And he said, "Hey, we're professionals. Don't worry about it." It was, so that's kind of defines our relationship. But yes, I think he should retire. Yeah.
I thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. Really appreciate it. Thank you very much. I think the most important thing going on right now is climate change. And I'm wondering, on a federal level, what your thoughts could be done, and specifically if you have any thoughts about a carbon tax, which I think would be a great way of getting things solved. Thank you.
Yeah, we passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which was the most poorly and most inaccurate title of a piece of legislation ever. It had nothing to do with inflation, but it did have a lot to do with climate. Again, the largest commitment of funds, to mostly in the form of tax credits, but about $300 billion in direct expenditures too, to deal with climate mitigation and climate change mitigation. And it's already having an impact because of, particularly with the tax incentives, there are huge investments being made by the private sector now in response to that. So, I think we've done something that's going to be very effective. I'm all in favor of a carbon tax. I think that's fine. The only problem is, how do you keep it from being regressive? And there are ways to do that, which if I were there and we were doing carbon tax, I'd want to make sure it was not a regressive tax.
Let's end it with you taking just a minute or two.
One more.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Just one thing. John, thank you so much for your service. We've known each other since the Marlowe Cook days.
Yeah.
So, and we're on the same side again. But since you have retired, and then Romney has come out with this about our the age with this white hair, I can say this, the age of our leadership.
Yeah.
I am curious, having been in government for so long, who do you see both in the Democrat and the Republican side coming up that has the strength to maybe pull this country back together?
I don't, you know,
I put you on the spot, darling.
well, I mean, I could come up with some Republicans who I actually think are quality people and good thinkers and so forth, but they're not in the leadership roles in the Republican Party. And so whether they could ever elevate to that point is another question. I mean, on the Democratic side, you know, I was thrilled that our 3 80-plus-year-old leaders finally decided to retire from their posts, even though they're still in the House. And we have Hakeem Jeffries, Catherine Clark, and Pete Aguilar, who were all elected in 2012. So that's amazing that the 3 leaders of the House were elected are such relatively new to the House. I look at people like Gretchen Whitmer, who I think if Joe Biden steps aside, she's my choice to replace him on the ticket. I think she would be a marvelous candidate and president. And there are a number of governors and some other people in the, I mean, I could name dozens in the House and Senate, dozens of Democrats who I think would be good. Now, whether or not, this is why I think Gretchen Whitmer would be so good, because she's able to bridge some of the partisan divide, not all of it, but some of it she has been able to. And I don't know whether the House Democrats, as bright as I think they are, could do that. And, you know, one of the things that's happened, and this began to happen shortly after I got there, but it's gotten to critical levels, is that both parties in Congress tend to view everything through an electoral prism. So regardless of what the issue is, the calculation always is, how do I get an electoral advantage over the other side? It's not, what's the best policy? And I mean, the Republicans are more guilty of it than we are, because we do have policy agendas. We do care about things and we have ideas. But one of the problems with the polarization now is that if one party refuses to participate in a particular proposal, you're going to get a proposal that has limited perspective. And when we did the ACA, we knew there were going to be a lot of unintended consequences, because we didn't get any Republican participation at all. And they have a different perspective, and they could have helped. They could have made it a better bill. Now, whether they voted for it or not, they could have made it, they could have improved it. And, you know, so we had, I think the number is close to 3,000 times in the Affordable Care Act where it says the secretary shall. So the Secretary of Health and Human Services would make the rules, because we didn't have the expertise and we were looking at it from one way. So I'll give you another example that's better. So we were doing, when we were doing the American Rescue Plan, and we wanted to include childcare in it, huge subsidy for people who needed childcare and so forth. Great idea, wanted to do it. I told the White House when I was talking to them, you know, this probably isn't a good idea because it doesn't focus on building capacity. So if we say we're going to give everybody vouchers who needs help to get childcare, and we don't have the capacity to do it, then we've made a false promise to them. And so, yeah, the benefit's great, but you got to make sure that there's a way for them to use the benefit. And we already have a problem with the shortage of childcare. So Democrats tend not to focus on that. They want to help the people, but they don't focus on the other side. Republicans might have been able to help with that. Now, we ended up not putting childcare in it because it was expensive, but that's an example of where we need both parties' perspectives if we're going to get the best possible products out of the legislative process. And right now, that's not happening.
John Yarmuth, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.